Hey there. Tonight we are stepping into a temple filled with smoke, a king's death hanging over the city, and a young man who thought he understood his world until he saw a throne so high that every certainty in him fell apart. Before this night is over, you will see Jerusalem glittering with wealth, while rot grows under the stones. A nation trembling before Assyria, lips touched by fire, and a voice that sends one man into a future where almost no one wants to hear the truth. If this is your kind of story, like the video, subscribe, and settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let the room go dim around you. We are going back to Judah, to dust and temple stone, to a city that looked secure until heaven opened above it. Isaiah was born into a complicated inheritance. God's people were divided. Israel stood to the north. Judah remained in the south. Families still shared memory of David, of covenant, of temple, of promise, and yet the land was already living with fracture. That kind of fracture is not always dramatic at first. Sometimes it is just a border on a map, a change in the tax collector, a different king issuing orders, a little less trust when travelers arrive from the wrong side of the line. Over time, though, the split enters the bloodstream of a people. It changes how fear moves. It changes how hope sounds. Jerusalem, where Isaiah grew up, was still the spiritual heart of Judah. If you stand there in the mind at dawn, before the heat thickens and before the market grows loud, the city can almost fool you into thinking it is whole. The Temple Mount catches early light. Stone walls glow pale gold. Priests begin their rhythms. Merchants shake dust from cloth and grain sacks. Somewhere, a goat objects to being part of breakfast, which is only fair. The city breathes like a living thing. It smells of bread, oil, old stone, smoke, sweat, dung, cheddar, and sacrifice, which is to say, it smells like history, trying very hard to look respectable. As a boy, Isaiah would have watched all this with wide eyes and a serious mind. The source transcript places him under the reign of Uzziah at first, and that matters because Uzziah was, for a time, the kind of king who makes a nation feel favored. Judah prospered. Walls were strengthened. Agriculture improved. Military confidence rose. Towers were built. The fields gave food. The army looked disciplined. The city gave the impression of upward motion, and people are often most spiritually drowsy when things appear to be going well. I have always found that one of the saddest rhythms in biblical history, disaster frightens people into clarity for a while. Prosperity lulls them into illusion. Under Uzziah, there was enough success to make injustice feel normal. If you walk through Jerusalem's richer quarters in those years, you see larger houses pressing against the street line, then pushing past it, then quietly swallowing neighboring land. The source rightly leans on Isaiah chapter 5 here. House to house, field to field, no space left. It is such a cold image. Not open robbery in the marketplace, not a soldier taking bread from a child, but property gathering to itself until poorer families find they have been edged out of life by the respectable appetite of the comfortable. Sin often prefers paperwork to spectacle. Imagine Isaiah still young, still mostly observing, standing in a narrow lane where one old family house has just been bought, or pressured, or folded into the estate of someone wealthier. The doorway is the same doorway. The lintel still carries the marks of hands from 3 generations. The courtyard tree still leans the same way, yet the place is no longer theirs. A servant now sweeps the threshold for a new owner. A widow leaves by the side gate with a bundle. A child looks back once, then keeps walking because children learn quickly when adults have run out of words. If you were standing there with Isaiah, you might not yet call it prophecy, but you would feel the moral bruise of it. And that bruise deepens because the problem is not only greed, it is worship turned sideways. Idols appear. False gods receive attention. Not always because people have stopped saying the Lord's name. Often it is more slippery than that. They still know the sacred vocabulary. They still keep holy routines. They still bring offerings. But their confidence is drifting elsewhere, into carved images, into political calculation, into whatever seems immediate and useful. This is the kind of spiritual decline that must have maddened Isaiah most. Not open atheism, competing devotion wrapped in familiar religious clothing. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, the larger world is changing with ugly speed. Assyria grows. That empire enters the story first as a rumor in the distance, then as a military fact, then as a pressure that seems to lean on every kingdom in the region at once. You can feel that kind of fear in a city long before the armies arrive. Prices shift. Conversations shorten when strangers pass. Officials begin discussing alliances in quieter rooms. Men who usually boast about courage start mentioning Egypt with too much interest. The source transcript is strong here because it lets Isaiah understand the political temptation before he publicly condemns it. Judah's leaders want security. That is natural enough. Assyria is not a poetic inconvenience. It is a machine of conquest. So the court thinks like a court. Horses, chariots, treaties, negotiation, survival through stronger friends. And Isaiah, even before the great temple moment, is already watching this with the discomfort of a man who sees that fear is teaching his people the wrong reflex. You know that feeling when a person grabs the nearest support in panic, not noticing it is rotten too. That is what foreign alliance must have looked like to him. Still, all of that pressure, all of that observation, all of that moral attention remains only preparation until the moment the source correctly places at the center of Isaiah's life. The year King Uzziah died. Death changes sound in a city. Even before official mourning has reached every lane, the atmosphere shifts. News travels with strange speed and stranger distortion. One person says the king is dead. Another says, no, he is dying. Another says there will be unrest. Another says his son will steady everything. Somewhere, women at a courtyard well lower their voices without planning to. Somewhere in the palace, sandals move quicker across stone. Somewhere near the temple, incense goes up as usual and feels entirely different because history has just opened its mouth. It is in that year, under that shadow, that Isaiah enters the temple and loses the safe shape of his old life. Let us go in slowly. The temple courts are stone and heat and layered reverence. Even in quiet hours, the place never feels empty. Steps hold memory. Doors hold memory. Bronze holds memory. Priests know where to stand. Worshippers know how far to come. The architecture teaches bodies what holiness demands before the mouth says a word. Isaiah enters as a man of Judah, as a man who knows the rituals, knows the stories, knows the names of the sacred things. Then suddenly knowledge fails him because the temple is no longer just a building. It is overtaken. He sees the Lord high and lifted up. The phrase is simple, almost too simple for what it carries. A throne, height, majesty, the train of the robe filling the temple. I have always loved that detail because it overwhelms through fabric, not weaponry. There is no need for thunderbolts here. The robe alone fills the house. Presence has become spatial. There is nowhere left in the room that is ordinary. Above are the seraphim, 6 wings each, 2 over the face, 2 over the feet, 2 for flying. They are not chatty angels from children's books. They are burning attendants of holiness, and they cry to one another with the kind of repetition that stops sounding repetitive and begins sounding eternal. Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, the whole earth full of glory. If you stand there long enough in imagination, it is the sound that undoes you first. Not because it is loud only, though the source says the temple shook, and that feels exactly right. It is the purity of it, the total lack of hesitation. Creatures made to stand in the presence of God, naming him without fear, while one human being below suddenly understands himself with terrifying accuracy. Isaiah does not react like a triumphant mystic. He reacts like a man who has just seen every impurity in himself at once. Woe is me! I am undone. A man of unclean lips among a people of unclean lips. That confession matters because it is personal and collective at the same time. He does not say only they are unclean. He says we. The same moral rot he has seen in the city is in him too. This is why his calling carries weight later. He is not sent as a spectator to other people's guilt. He is sent as a man scorched clean through his own. And then comes the coal. One of the seraphim takes it from the altar with tongs. That detail always slows me down. Even a seraph does not take it casually. The coal is live, holy, dangerous. It comes from the altar, from sacrifice, from the place where sin and fire meet in ritual form. Then it is brought to Isaiah's mouth. You can imagine the heat before contact. That is the terrible mercy of it. The body knows what is coming and cannot turn away. Then the touch, brief, sharp, absolute, guilt taken away, sin atoned for. I do not think the cleansing here is gentle in the sentimental sense. I think it is exact, like surgery before anesthetic, too near the nerve to be anything else. Yet afterward comes not destruction, but fitness. The mouth that confessed uncleanness becomes the mouth that can now speak for God. I've always found that one of the most frighteningly beautiful images in all prophetic literature, not a poet crowned, a sinner cauterized. Then the voice asks the question that changes everything. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Isaiah answers immediately. Here am I. Send me. No bargaining. No long negotiation. No clever excuse dressed as humility. He has seen too much to play cautious now. Once holiness has remade the mouth, silence becomes another kind of disobedience. And yet the commission he receives is not the sort that flatters a new prophet. God does not say, "Go and they will celebrate you," or "Go and they will finally become wise." He says, in effect, "Go and speak to a people who will keep hearing without understanding, seeing without perceiving, their hearts dull, their ears heavy, their eyes closed." I think this is where Isaiah becomes especially suitable for a dark sleep story. His mission begins with the knowledge that truth does not guarantee welcome. He asks, "How long?" It is such a human question. Not can I escape it. Not can you choose someone easier. Only how long? The answer is desolation. Cities laid waste. Houses without inhabitants. Land empty. The source transcript keeps this severity in place. And it should. Isaiah is not commissioned into a golden age. He is commissioned into slow collapse. But then, because God seems to love planting impossible hope inside ruined landscapes, another image appears. A terebinth. An oak, cut down, yet leaving a stump. The holy seed in the stump. The remnant. The surviving line. The future, hidden in what looks finished. That is how we must leave him for now. Not as the old observer of Jerusalem's compromise, but as a man remade by smoke, fire, trembling stone, and a voice that gave him both judgment and remnant in one breath. He leaves the temple with his mission burning in him, and beyond the gates, the city still looks mostly normal. Market sounds continue. Rich men still buy land. Idols still stand. Politicians still whisper about alliances. No one in the lane knows that a prophet has just been broken open above them. In the next movement, he will begin to speak, and the city will learn, slowly and often unwillingly, that its prosperity, its worship, and its politics are all being weighed against the holiness he has seen. After the temple, Isaiah does not disappear into private mysticism. He comes back into the city, and that is one of the hardest parts of the story. It is always easier to imagine holiness on a mountain, in a sanctuary, in a smoke-filled vision where everyone agrees something immense has happened. It is harder to carry that vision into streets where merchants are haggling, widows are being ignored, officials are flattering kings, and respectable men have already decided they prefer convenient lies to truthful warnings. The source transcript moves from calling into public confrontation, and that movement feels exactly right. A prophet who has seen the throne cannot spend long admiring himself for it. He has to speak. So let us follow him out of the temple and back into Jerusalem. The city is as it was, and yet not as it was. This is one of the painful changes prophetic people suffer. The world remains outwardly ordinary, but they can no longer see it ordinarily. Isaiah walks through familiar streets, but now the contrast between the Lord high and lifted up and the city's daily habits must feel almost unbearable. Stone walls, yes. Olive cellars, yes. Priests, judges, nobles, women at the well, children darting through alleys, soldiers with polished gear, all the visible furniture of a functioning kingdom. Yet under it he senses moral fracture as clearly as if the walls themselves had begun to split. Idolatry is one of the first sores he presses. The source makes that plain. The land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands. I have always thought that phrase is one of the sharpest little knives in Isaiah. The work of their hands. A people who were meant to be shaped by God instead fall before what their own fingers made. There is something almost pathetic in that, like a potter kneeling before a cracked bowl and calling it master. Imagine Isaiah watching a carved image being set in a household shrine. Cedar polished, metal ornament perhaps, a little oil lamp flickering before it. The family is not cackling in villainy. That is the unsettling part. They are probably sincere in the ordinary human way. They want blessing, fertility, safety, protection. They want a God they can touch, a ritual they can control, a little guarantee against the uncertainty of war and weather. But Isaiah hears blasphemy in the whole arrangement, not because wood and bronze are evil in themselves, but because they are being asked to bear the weight of trust that belongs only to the Holy One of Israel. And behind the idol problem stands the justice problem, which in many ways is even more brutal because it plays out on human faces. The source uses Isaiah chapter 3 and chapter 1 here, and I am glad, because these are not vague moral complaints. The prophet accuses the elders and leaders directly. The spoil of the poor is in their houses. They grind the faces of the poor. It is such a severe image, grinding faces, that one almost wants to look away from it. But Isaiah does not let you. He has seen enough divine holiness to know that soft words can become a form of dishonesty. If you were standing beside him in one of Jerusalem's broader streets, you might see the whole accusation at once. A noble house expanding outward, fine garments moving through a doorway, servants carrying grain. Then just beyond that brightness, a laborer with dust on his legs and worry in his mouth, bargaining for too little, hoping his children can eat, already defeated before the negotiation begins because the scales of society were weighted before he ever arrived. A widow waits. An orphan learns silence early. An older man lowers his eyes when a creditor passes. None of this has to be theatrical to be wicked. In fact, its quietness is part of the sin. Isaiah says true worship is impossible under those conditions. That is what makes him so difficult. Many societies can survive having religious people and unjust people living side by side, especially if they are the same people and no one insists on connecting the two facts. Isaiah insists on it. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Stop doing evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Defend the fatherless. Plead for the widow. His message is not that ritual is worthless. It is that ritual without justice is an insult. Go to the temple if you must, he seems to say, but do not imagine incense can hide your treatment of the vulnerable. I have always found that part of Isaiah strangely refreshing. He is not impressed by performance. A choir does not move him. A polished feast day does not move him. A crowded altar does not move him. He wants to know how the powerless sleep at night under the rule of those who sing loudly on holy days. The source then turns to the vineyard song, and I think it deserves to be lingered over because it is one of the most beautiful traps in prophetic literature. Isaiah begins almost like a poet at a feast. Let me sing for my beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. The listener relaxes. A vineyard song sounds harmless, pleasant, rustic. Then the knife goes in. The vineyard has had everything. Cleared stones, choice vines, watchtower, winepress, care, investment, attention. The owner looks for good grapes and finds wild ones. Sour fruit, rot where sweetness should have grown. It is such a devastating metaphor because everyone listening would understand the effort of a vineyard. You do not get grapes by accident. You prepare. You protect. You wait through seasons. So when the fruit comes bad, the failure feels moral, not merely agricultural. Judah is the vineyard. God is the owner. The fruit expected is justice. The fruit found is bloodshed. The cry expected is righteousness. The cry heard is distress. If you want to feel the weight of this properly, imagine Isaiah speaking it in a place where the wealthy and the powerful can hear. Perhaps someone smiles at first, thinking a charming country parable is underway. Then, slowly, as the details gather, their faces change. He is talking about us. The watchtower is our history. The vines are our people. The bad fruit is what we have become. That is good prophecy. It lets people step willingly into the accusation before they realize the door has shut behind them. And then the judgment. Hedge removed. Wall broken. Vineyard trampled. No pruning. No rain. Briars and thorns. Isaiah understands that abandonment can be more frightening than direct violence. A society sustained by divine care can become a wasteland if that care is withdrawn. The terrifying thing is not that God must invent punishment out of nowhere. It is that he can stop restraining the consequences already braided into injustice. While all this is happening within Judah, political fear is sharpening on the edges. Syria and the northern kingdom, Israel or Ephraim, turn against Jerusalem. The source correctly frames this as one of the major crises through which Isaiah becomes advisor as well as accuser. Ahaz sits on the throne now, and fear moves through the royal house like wind through trees. That is the exact image the text gives, and it is perfect. The heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Stand with me by the aqueduct road where Isaiah is sent to meet the king. Water moves beside the path. Practical, cold, necessary. The city is anxious. Messengers have been coming and going. Soldiers look more alert than brave. Courtiers are already planning the usual human response. Alliance, negotiation, desperate calculation. Ahaz is probably doing what rulers often do in crisis, inspecting infrastructure, because walls and water at least still obey practical logic when politics starts behaving like fever. Then Isaiah arrives, and with him comes his son, Shear-Jashub. A remnant shall return. I love that God sends the child too. In prophetic stories, names are never only names. They are portable theology. Every time someone speaks that boy's name, they speak survival into a doomed hour. Isaiah tells Ahaz not to fear the two smoldering stubs of firewood. It is a wonderfully deflating description of threats that feel enormous to everyone else. Syria and Ephraim are dangerous. Yes, but in Isaiah's mouth they are already reduced to smoking ends. This is what prophetic sight can do. It does not deny danger. It denies danger's ultimate sovereignty. But Ahaz has already made his choice in his heart. The source understands this perfectly. When God, through Isaiah, offers a sign, any sign, from the depths below or the heights above, Ahaz refuses with pious-sounding language. I will not ask. I will not test the Lord. On the surface it sounds reverent. Underneath it is avoidance. He does not refuse because he trusts. He refuses because he has already decided to place his trust somewhere else. I have always found that moment painfully human. People often use good religious language to hide bad spiritual decisions. Ahaz does not want a sign, because a sign would make obedience harder to evade. So Isaiah gives the sign anyway. The young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. The source treats this as both immediate and long horizon, which is exactly how the text lives in the tradition. In the near crisis, it means Judah is not abandoned to chaos. In the deeper current of Scripture, it opens towards something much larger, something Christians later hear fully in the story of Jesus. But even before later fulfillment, the prophetic force of the sign is clear. Ahaz seeks security in calculation. Isaiah places security in presence. Not horses, not treaties, God with us. That contrast is the beating heart of Isaiah's politics. He is not apolitical. He speaks into war, treaties, kingship, illness, Ziga, Ampia, but he refuses to grant politics the dignity of ultimacy. Judah's leaders keep thinking the world will be saved by the right arrangement of foreign strength. Isaiah keeps returning to the same maddening proposition. Trust the Lord. That proposition sounds serene in a devotional booklet. In a threatened kingdom, it sounds almost scandalous. And that is exactly why his words matter. The source goes on to Hezekiah later. Of course, to illness and healing and the backward shadow and the Assyrian threat. But here in the Ahaz crisis, the logic is already fully present. Fear drives rulers toward false refuge. Prophecy interrupts that reflex. The nation is asked whether it will build itself on visible power or invisible faithfulness. Most of the time, if we are honest, visible power feels easier to clasp. As evening falls on Jerusalem, in this part of the story, the city is tense. The poor are still poor. The powerful are still maneuvering. The temple still stands. Ahaz still refuses in his polished way. The sign has been spoken into the air. Somewhere a child is crying. Somewhere soldiers are checking leather straps before sleep. Somewhere a woman is lighting a lamp and wondering whether tomorrow will bring war. Isaiah walks back through the city carrying the same burden he carried out of the temple. Only now it has found words. Judgment, injustice, false trust, remnant, presence. They are all in motion now. And that is where we will leave him for the moment. Not defeated, not successful in the shallow sense either, but established in the role he will keep carrying. He will speak to kings who do not want him, to people who hear without understanding, to a society that hides violence beneath ritual and fear beneath diplomacy. In the next movement, those tensions deepen through Hezekiah, Assyria, sickness, miraculous reversal, and the widening of Isaiah's voice beyond Judah toward the empires themselves. After the fear under Ahaz, after the trembling by the aqueduct and the sign that was given to a king who did not want it, time keeps moving, because prophecy rarely receives the courtesy of ending when a lesson has been spoken. Isaiah remains in Jerusalem, and the city continues to age around him. Children become adults. Kings weaken. Markets open and close. The smell of sacrifice keeps rising. Dust keeps settling on sandals and thresholds and fig leaves and military cloaks. And all the while, Assyria grows larger in the imagination of every small kingdom around it, like a storm front that first appears only as a dark line, then as a certainty. That is the world into which Hezekiah comes, and the source rightly turns toward him as a different kind of ruler from Ahaz. He is not perfect. No king in these stories ever is, and perhaps that is part of their usefulness. But Hezekiah does at least seem capable of trembling toward the right thing. He can fear. Yes. He can weep. He can listen. That already makes him very different from the polished evasions of his father. If you stand in Jerusalem at the beginning of his reign, the city feels like a place trying to decide which soul it has. There are still idols to tear down. High places still hold memory of compromise. Priests move with renewed seriousness. Courtiers watch the king with caution and hope in equal measure. Some men smell reform and call it righteousness. Other men smell reform and call it bad policy. There is always someone in every generation who thinks obedience is an unrealistic budget item. I have always found Hezekiah's story moving because it is full of the vulnerability that power hates most. He becomes king in a dangerous time, and then, before the political crisis reaches its full bitterness, his own body fails him. The source dwells on that in a way I appreciate, because illness changes the scale of all public ambition. A man can be thinking of walls, tribute, alliances, strategy, horsemen, grain, Assyria, Egypt, and the future of a kingdom. Then one sickness enters the room, and suddenly the only important questions are breath, pain, time, and whether morning will arrive before the body gives up. Picture the royal chamber. Heavy woven hangings, stone underfoot, a brazier breathing out low heat, servants trying to move quietly and failing because fear makes even careful hands clumsy, physicians with herbs and cloths and grave expressions that reveal too much even before they speak. The king on his bed, skin hot or cold depending on the turn of the sickness, eyes fixed too often on one corner of the room, as if health might be hiding there in silence. Outside the palace, ordinary life continues, which is one of the cruelest facts about illness. Bread is still sold. Soldiers still change watch. Donkeys still complain. Sunlight still touches the city walls. Only in the sick room does time become strange. Then Isaiah enters with the message no ruler ever wants to hear. Set your house in order, for you shall die, and not live. There is no ornament on that sentence. No cushioning. No courtly perfume. Just the blunt edge of mortality placed in the middle of a kingly chamber. I have always respected Isaiah for that. He does not soften truth simply because the bed is royal. And Hezekiah does something profoundly human. He turns his face to the wall and weeps. The source treats this with tenderness, and I think that is correct. It would be easy to make a kingly prayer theatrical. It is more intimate than that. A wall is a strange witness. It receives breath, tears, whispered words, and says nothing back. Yet people in grief often turn toward walls because a wall allows privacy without offering comfort too quickly. Hezekiah prays into stone. He remembers his faithfulness. He pleads not like a philosopher, but like a mortal man who has just been told the edge is near. If you slow that moment down, you can feel the room around him. A tear moving into beard or linen. Fingers curled into the coverlet. The air seeming to thicken because everyone nearby knows this prayer is no formal recital. It is need laid bare. Outside the chamber, a servant is waiting not to make noise. Inside the chamber, the king is doing what Ahaz so often refused to do. He is bringing fear to God instead of carrying it sideways into calculation. Then the word of the Lord comes again to Isaiah before he has gone far. 15 more years. Deliverance. Mercy. It is a startling reversal, and yet it does not feel cheap, because the story has made the fragility real before the rescue arrives. I think that is why the answer is moving. It comes into an already truthful room. And then the sign. The shadow on the steps going backward. I have always loved the stillness of that miracle. It is not loud in the way the temple vision was loud. No seraphim. No shaking thresholds. No coal. Only light and stone and the impossible behavior of a shadow. If you have ever watched afternoon sunlight creep slowly across a stair or courtyard, you know how calm such motion usually is, almost too patient to notice. Now imagine that order bending, not rushing, simply retreating, a shadow returning where it should only advance. The whole city might not even understand it at once, but for those who do, it must feel like time itself has taken one respectful step backward before the God of Israel. That image fits Isaiah perfectly. His ministry is full of reversals that look impossible until they happen. Doom with a remnant in it. Judgment with mercy inside it. Death interrupted. A king spared. The source holds this scene in the right mood. Not triumphal, but hushed. Yet mercy in Isaiah never means the end of pressure. Hezekiah rises, but Assyria still stands. This is where the political tension sharpens again, and it does so with more seriousness than ever. Assyria is no longer rumor. It is a machine pressing on the whole region. The northern kingdom has already learned what Assyrian force can do. Cities fall. Populations are displaced. Power is displayed as terror. Jerusalem feels the weight of that knowledge long before the siege draws near in full force. And what do frightened courts do when empire presses at the edge of the map? they start looking sideways. Egypt becomes the old temptation again. Horses, chariots, diplomacy. The source is right to make this a repeated theme, because it shows the deep consistency of Isaiah. He is not merely anti-idol. He is anti-false trust in every form. An idol is a visible thing trusted in place of God. So is an alliance. When clutched with ultimate hope, so are horses, chariots, walls, tribute, clever speeches, and the flattering lie that one more political arrangement can save a people already morally sick. If you walk through the royal precinct in those days, you can almost hear the arguments. One advisor says Egypt has cavalry. Another says Assyria cannot be resisted alone. Another lowers his voice and says, piety is admirable, but steel is measurable. Another says the prophet has never had to count soldiers. Another says perhaps we can trust God and still sign the treaty, which is usually the sentence spoken just before compromise dresses itself as wisdom. Meanwhile, Isaiah stands in all this human buzzing and says what he has said all along in one form or another. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. Honestly, that line has always pierced me a little. Flesh and not spirit. It does not mean bodies are worthless. It means what is human cannot carry divine weight forever without breaking. Judah keeps trying to hand its deepest fear to things that cannot bear it. Then the Assyrian crisis crests. Sennacherib comes. His officers speak arrogance outside Jerusalem's walls. Threat becomes voice. This is one of those moments in Scripture where political theater and spiritual warfare almost merge. The language of siege is always about more than stone. It is about imagination. Break the city's confidence, and the walls may fall before the battering ram ever touches them. The source does well to keep Isaiah and Hezekiah in relation here, rather than isolating one from the other. Hezekiah receives the blasphemous words. He takes the letter. He goes to the house of the Lord. He spreads the matter before God. Again, this is what distinguishes him from Ahaz. He still feels fear, but fear sends him toward prayer rather than away from it. Picture that act slowly, the letter unrolled. Ink on material. Human contempt, preserved in lines and curves. Then the king entering the temple with it in his hand. Sandals on stone. Breath held. Priests watching. The scroll laid out before the Lord as if to say, here is the insult. Here's the threat. Here is the thing too heavy for me to carry alone. There is something almost childlike in that act, and I mean that as praise. A child brings the frightening thing to the father. A king finally remembers he is not the highest power in the room. And Isaiah answers, he says the Lord has heard. He says the proud invader will not triumph as he imagines. He says the city will be defended. The source keeps the story in that suspended place where trust and terror still coexist. And I think that is right. We know the outcome from reading. They did not know it while the night was unfolding. There are few atmospheres more tense than a besieged city trying to sleep. Listen to it. The wall guards changing watch. Mothers keeping children quiet. Men checking slings. Spears. Doors. Water jars. Anything their hands can do because hands hate helplessness. Somewhere an old man recites psalms too low for anyone but God to hear. Somewhere a candle gutters in a draught. Somewhere a soldier jokes weakly because people often try humor when dread has become too thick to breathe comfortably. Then morning comes, and the Assyrian camp is broken. The angel of the Lord has moved in the night. The source does not sensationalize this, and that restraint is wise. The point is not spectacle. The point is reversal. The force Judah could not defeat, God could humble without strain. The empire that felt absolute proves not to be absolute. That is one of Isaiah's great themes, played out in history before the eyes of a city. I think that is why the shadow sign and the Assyrian deliverance belong together in the story. In both cases, time and power behave differently once God enters the crisis directly. The ordinary movement of shadow reverses. The ordinary movement of empire reverses. What looks fixed turns out to be contingent. Yet even here, Isaiah does not become a court mascot. He remains dangerous because he speaks truth after mercy as well as before it. The source hints at that in the Babylonian Envoys episode, where Hezekiah, flattered and perhaps a little too pleased with his own recovery and wealth, shows too much. Isaiah immediately sees farther than the moment. Babylon is not yet the immediate terror Assyria is, but Isaiah perceives another future wound already forming. Mercy does not entitle Judah to carelessness. That is one of the hardest prophetic lessons. A miracle does not cancel the need for humility. In fact, it may increase it. So leave the royal court now with its strange mixture of gratitude and lingering pride. Leave the sick room where tears were heard. Leave the temple where letters were spread and answers given. Leave the walls where Assyria once threatened and failed. In all these places, Isaiah has moved not as a politician in religious dress, but as a witness to the reality that God governs illness, shadow, empire, and prayer together. And that prepares the widening movement to come. Because once Isaiah has spoken through the crises of Judah, his voice begins reaching beyond Judah altogether. Egypt, Babylon, Moab, Damascus, Tyre. The nations themselves come under the same divine gaze. The prophet who began in a city of compromised worship will soon be speaking over the whole map, declaring that no empire, no river kingdom, no trading port, no mountain fortress stands outside the rule of the Holy One he saw, high and lifted up. After the sick room, after the backward shadow, after the Assyrian threat has been bent and not allowed to finish its boast, Isaiah's voice grows larger. That is one of the most striking things about his ministry. He begins in Jerusalem with his own people's corruption, but he does not stay there. The holiness he saw in the temple was too vast for local religion. Holy, 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 the whole earth full of glory. Once you hear that in the right way, it becomes impossible to think God only manages one small corner of the map. So the source transcript widens, and the widening feels almost like standing on a high place and watching the known world arrange itself under a stormy sky. Babylon, Egypt, Ethiopia, Moab, Damascus, Tyre. One by one, the nations come into view, not as distant curiosities, but as living powers whose pride, fear, commerce, armies, and idols all stand exposed. Isaiah becomes not merely the prophet of Judah, but the witness that every empire eventually answers to something beyond itself. I have always loved the scale shift there. A true prophet does not only tell his own village what it is doing wrong, he hears the weather of history. Let us begin with Babylon. Even though in Isaiah's earlier life, Assyria is the immediate terror, that is part of what makes the Babylon oracles so eerie. Prophecy often sees past the nearest blaze to the fire not yet lit. If you imagine a Judahite listener hearing words against Babylon before Babylon has become the obvious monster, the effect must have been strange. Why speak so forcefully against a power not yet sitting on our throat? Because God is not surprised by succession. He judges futures before they arrive as headlines. Babylon in Isaiah's vision is grandeur with wrought in the foundation. High walls, wealth, astronomers perhaps looking upward with too much confidence, merchants, priests, military men, all the machinery of a civilization that imagines itself durable. Yet Isaiah sees it as a place already moving toward humiliation. The proud city lowered, the shining arrogance of empire turned into silence. It is one of the great comforts and terrors of prophetic literature that success is never taken at face value. Then Egypt. Egypt always enters biblical imagination with a complex shadow. Ancient prestige, river abundance, horses and chariots, that old temptation again, refuge and trap braided together. The source does well to linger here, because Egypt is not only another foreign nation. It is the symbolic alternative trust of Judah's leadership. When fear rises, some always want to go down to Egypt, literally or politically, because Egypt looks old enough and massive enough to feel reliable. Isaiah will not allow that comfort. He sees idols trembling in Egypt. He sees the proud, wise men of the Nile giving poor counsel. He sees a nation rich in old memory discovering that old memory cannot save it. Yet, and this matters greatly for his larger theology, he also sees the possibility of healing. Egypt struck, then healed. Egypt joining Assyria and Israel in blessing under God. I have always found that one of the boldest turns in the book, Isaiah does not merely condemn the nations. He imagines even enemies drawn into redemption. Judgment for him is never only destruction. It is exposure on the way to possible transformation. That same pattern appears with other peoples too, though not always so tenderly. Moab receives lament and humiliation. Damascus fades. Tyre, the merchant city with sea wind in its garments and profit in its blood, learns that trade is not eternity. Ethiopia appears in the haze of distant diplomatic intrigue and human hope. Every nation brings its own scent into the prophetic chamber. River mud, cheddar, salt, horses, incense, coin, blood, wet sails, desert heat. And yet over all of them falls the same unsettling fact. No empire is self-explaining. No border is ultimate. No gods of carved wood, polished stone, military strength, or economic brilliance can outstare the one Isaiah saw in the temple. If you were standing beside him now, not in one street of Jerusalem, but on a ridge in the imagination above the old world, you might see banners in the distance, columns of dust, river valleys, mountain fortresses, port cities glittering, priests in foreign shrines, kings making promises they cannot keep, generals sleeping badly, merchants counting profit by lamplight, mothers in every language trying to keep children safe. The human world is vast, and Isaiah speaks over it like a man who has been given access to a higher balcony than politics can build. The source then presses toward the day of the Lord, and this is where Isaiah's tone becomes especially grave. The day of the Lord is not simply a date on a divine calendar. It is the collapse of misplaced height. Everything lofty brought low. Cedars, mountains, towers, ships, human pride in all its visible forms. I think this is one reason Isaiah remains such a difficult prophet to modern people. He does not only criticize vice, he criticizes exaltation itself when it forgets its creaturely limits. Imagine a cedar of Lebanon in stormlight, tall, old, fragrant, admired by generations. Then imagine Isaiah using that image not for romance but for humbling. Or think of a fortified wall, thick stone, watchmen above, a city trusting its engineering. And hear the prophet say even this will not finally save what God has decided to weigh. The poetry is beautiful. The theology is merciless in the most cleansing sense. And yet, it is not nihilistic. That matters. Isaiah's judgment is never the bored destruction of a man who hates the world. It is the severe honesty of a man who loves reality too much to flatter illusion. Pride must come down, because pride cannot heal. Idolatry must collapse, because idolatry cannot carry the weight people place on it. Empires must be shown their limit, because otherwise they begin calling themselves eternal. And that always ends with ordinary people crushed under someone else's dream of permanence. The source is especially good when it lets judgment broaden into atmosphere. Wind over ruined places, idols abandoned to bats and caves, nations reduced from noise to hush. There is something deeply sleep story worthy in that imagery, because the fear does not come from gore. It comes from the sense that all the loud machinery of human greatness can suddenly go quiet under a larger verdict. I have always found ruined city imagery strangely calming when written well, not because ruin is pleasant, but because it reminds us that human arrogance is not as permanent as it feels in the middle of its own speeches. A toppled gate is quieter than a tyrant. A broken idol is less exhausting than a living lie. Still, Isaiah never lingers in destruction for the sake of mood alone. The source makes that clear, and it is one of the reasons his book breathes rather than suffocates. Every widening of judgment also clears space for a widening of hope. If all nations are accountable, then all nations are also visible to God. If Egypt can be struck and healed, if Assyria can one day stand in blessing alongside Israel, if Babylon can fall without history ending, then the map itself is more fluid than empire thinks. God is not merely the tribal protector of Judah. He is the Lord of history, which means even foreign nations can be judged toward a future we would not have guessed. That larger vision begins preparing the most luminous parts of Isaiah. Though we are not fully there yet, you can feel them approaching in the distance, like first light before sunrise. The nations judged, yes. The proud lowered, yes. But lowered into what? into emptiness only. Isaiah will not let the story end there. Before we move toward that brighter horizon, I want to stay a little longer with the emotional experience of hearing such oracles in ancient Judah. Imagine being a small nation squeezed between powers, with Assyria breathing down your neck, Egypt seducing your politicians, Babylon not yet central, but present at the edges of imagination, and then hearing your prophet speak as though none of these empires is the true center of the story. It would sound either insane or magnificent depending on how much fear had colonized your soul. You know that feeling when everyone in the room is talking about the obvious threat, and one person keeps insisting that the obvious threat is not actually the deepest issue. That person is usually annoying until events prove otherwise. Isaiah must have spent much of his life sounding like that. And yet his boldness grows out of vision, not temperament alone. He saw the Lord high and lifted up. Once that image enters a mind properly, Egypt becomes smaller. Assyria becomes smaller. Babylon becomes smaller. Not harmless. Never harmless. But smaller. Human size reasserts itself under divine size. That is the real medicine Isaiah keeps trying to administer. And it is medicine people resist because fear loves magnifying visible dangers until invisible reality feels childish by comparison. The prophet refuses that surrender. He keeps speaking until maps themselves begin to look provisional. So stand with him now on that high interior ridge. Hear oracles moving outward like slow thunder. Babylon judged. Egypt shaken and then healed. Moab mourning. Tyre humbled. Damascus fading. Ethiopia drawn into the same divine horizon. Proud heights lowered. Cedars bowed. Ships, towers, and idols all discovering their scale. The whole old world under one gaze. It is a severe beauty, and it prepares the gentlest beauty still to come. Because once the nations have been gathered under judgment, once history has been stripped of its false absolutes, Isaiah begins speaking more clearly than ever about restoration. A shoot from a stump. A king unlike the others. A world where predator and prey lie down together. A servant who bears what others cannot. A banquet on the mountain. Death swallowed. Tears wiped away. The next movement takes us there, toward the strange and tender heart of Isaiah, where the prophet who knew collapse so well becomes also the prophet of the most luminous hope in all the Hebrew scriptures. After the nations have been weighed, after proud walls and proud kings and proud economies have been told with unnerving calm that they are not the center of history, Isaiah begins doing something almost impossible. He starts speaking hope without sounding naive. That is one of the reasons his book feels so unlike easy optimism. He has seen too much ruin to speak cheaply. When hope comes in Isaiah, it comes carrying ash on its sandals. The source transcript turns here toward the stump of Jesse, and I think that is exactly the right place to begin. Because a stump is not a triumphant image. It is what remains after cutting. It is the memory of a tree, the stubborn witness that something tall once stood here and does not stand here now. If you walk through a field after trees have been taken down, the stumps are the saddest part. They are lower than memory and yet still anchored in earth. To speak of a royal line as a stump is to admit collapse first, and only then allow the possibility of renewal. Imagine the house of David reduced in that way, not gone in the sense of mythically erased. Worse, almost surviving as memory, as remnant wood, as a wounded root in dry ground. That is where Isaiah plants one of the tenderest and strangest promises in all of Scripture. A shoot shall come forth from the stump of Jesse. A branch shall grow out of his roots. The language is botanical, patient, almost shy. Not thunder. Not a chariot descending from the clouds. A shoot. Something green and small. Something easy to overlook if you were still addicted to the spectacle of empire. I have always found that image deeply consoling. God does not need the old tree to remain standing in order to continue his purpose. He can work through what looks ruined. He can make life rise from what history has cut low. Honestly, that may be one of the most useful truths in Isaiah for tired people in any age. Divine promise does not depend on conditions that still look impressive. The source rightly lingers over the figure who grows from that stump. This ruler is not merely another king in the old mold. He is marked first by the Spirit, not by court training, not by military inheritance alone, not by palace charm. The Spirit of the Lord rests upon him. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, fear of the Lord. It is a kingly portrait, yes, but it feels unlike ordinary monarchy. Most rulers in history are shaped by flattery, fear, and the bad habit of mistaking power for perception. Isaiah's promised ruler sees differently. He does not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear. That line always catches in me a little. What a relief it would be if the one in charge were not fooled by surface. If you sit with that long enough, the contrast with earlier kings becomes almost painful. Ahaz frightened and evasive. Hezekiah better, yet still fragile, and at times too pleased with his own significance. Uzziah strong, then swollen with pride. Human kings come with the usual human bruises. This coming ruler arrives as though the office itself were being healed from within, and his rule has texture. That matters. Isaiah does not speak only in broad abstractions. He gives the feel of justice. The poor are not ignored. The meek are not ornamental casualties in someone else's glorious policy. He judges with righteousness. He decides with equity. The weak finally enter the center of concern. I think that is one reason the passage remains so beloved. It is not only royal grandeur, it is moral repair. A ruler who will not grind the faces of the poor because he will see them clearly from the beginning. The source then moves, as it should, into the peaceable kingdom imagery, and there the poetry becomes almost dreamlike. The wolf dwelling with the lamb, the leopard lying down with the young goat, the calf, the lion, the fattened calf together, a little child leading them. We know these lines so well that we sometimes forget how strange they are. This is not politics in the ordinary sense anymore. This is creation itself, learning a new posture. If you were standing in a field at dawn and actually saw such things, I think the first feeling would not be delight. It would be stunned silence. Predators and prey carry old knowledge in their bodies. Teeth know. Hooves know. Flight knows. Fear knows. To imagine that order relaxed without violence, without trick, without the false peace of exhaustion, is to imagine the whole world healed beneath the skin. I have always loved the little child leading them. Not a general, not a hunter, not a fortified wall. A child. It is almost humorous in the gentlest possible way, as though God were quietly smiling at all our adult obsessions with force. We build arsenals. He imagines toddlers directing wolves. The source is also wise to keep the mountain imagery nearby. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. The earth full of the knowledge of the Lord as waters cover the sea. There again the scale widens. The peaceable kingdom is not a charming pastoral painting for nursery walls. It is the outward sign of a deeper saturation. Knowledge of God, reaching creation the way water fills a basin, leaving no pocket dry. You know that feeling when rain has fallen so thoroughly across the land that dust disappears and every surface seems to breathe differently. Isaiah imagines that kind of thoroughness in spiritual terms. No corner of creation left under the old violence. And yet he never forgets history while speaking this way. That is part of the wonder. He is not retreating from public sorrow into private fantasy. He is looking through judgment toward a restored order more solid than anything the old kingdoms ever built. The branch from Jesse belongs to real history. The nations seek him. The dispersed are gathered. The divided people are healed. Judah and Ephraim no longer tear at one another. Ancient fracture itself begins to close. The source touches this reconciliation beautifully, and I think it should be heard slowly. A divided people has lived so long with internal tension that many probably forgot unity could feel like blessing rather than mere nostalgia. For Isaiah to imagine Ephraim not envying Judah and Judah not harassing Ephraim is already a political miracle before wolves and lambs even enter the meadow. Sometimes the most unbelievable peace is not among animals. It is among relatives. As the vision unfolds, the remnant theme returns in brighter form. A remnant gathered from exile, from Assyria, from Egypt, from islands of the sea, from places where history scattered them like seed into hard ground. I find that repetition deeply moving. Isaiah never gives up the remnant. Even in judgment, it stayed alive like a nerve. Here, it blossoms into return. Roads open in impossible places. Pathways through the sea echo older deliverance stories. The God who once brought Israel out can bring Israel back again. There is a liturgical joy to these chapters too. Songs rising, wells of salvation, water drawn with rejoicing. If earlier parts of Isaiah's ministry smelled of smoke and siege and hard prophecy in the palace corridor, these chapters begin to smell like morning after rain. Not because sorrow is forgotten, but because it has finally been outlived. And still, even here, there is shadow enough to keep the beauty from becoming thin. The branch grows from a stump. The gathering follows scattering. Peace follows long violence. The child leads animals that, by old instinct, should have been killing one another. The whole promise is shaped like healing over scar tissue. That is why it feels trustworthy. It does not pretend the wound was shallow. The source also allows the messianic current to remain broad and luminous, rather than flattening it too quickly into later theological shorthand. I appreciate that. Isaiah speaks in a register large enough to hold immediate royal hope, future Davidic expectation, and in Christian reading the deepest anticipation of Christ himself. The text is spacious. It can carry several horizons at once. That is part of its greatness. It does not rush the mystery. If you were sitting with Isaiah at the edge of evening, after hearing him condemn kings, nations, greed, idols, false trusts, after hearing him speak of Assyria and Babylon and all the machinery of collapse, and then you heard him begin describing a shoot from a stump, a spirit-filled ruler, and a world where violence loosens its grip even in the bodies of beasts, I think you might feel the peculiar dizziness that true hope causes. Not sentiment. Reorientation. The whole imagination being asked to turn toward a future that does not behave according to current evidence. Perhaps that is why such hope can sound almost eerie. We are so used to realism, meaning the repetition of damage. Isaiah insists that the most realistic thing of all may be a promise not yet visible. Before we leave this part, let us stay a little longer in that impossible field. Morning light low and soft. A wolf lying down without hunger in its eyes. A lamb no longer rigid with terror. Dust settled. Grass holding dew. A child moving among them with the absent-minded confidence children sometimes have around what adults consider dangerous. Beyond the field, perhaps, the remnants of old fortresses and burnt watchtowers still stand as memory. But here in the meadow, another order has entered the world. That is what Isaiah keeps seeing. Not merely survival after judgment, harmony after fracture. Creation itself taught a new peace. And from there the vision deepens still further. Because even a righteous ruler and a healed creation do not explain everything. Human sorrow is more intimate than national collapse. Guilt is deeper than political failure. The next movement in Isaiah moves into one of the most haunting figures in all Scripture. The servant who suffers, bears grief, carries iniquity, and somehow brings healing by taking wounds into himself. The prophet who has already shown us kings and nations will next show us redemption through a figure who does not conquer by looking impressive at all. So before the field disappears entirely, keep one last image. The stump still rough with the memory of the axe. Fresh green life rising from it anyway. A little breeze moving the new shoot almost too gently to notice. The whole future of a people hidden in that modest movement. No trumpet. No palace announcement. No international summit. Only life returning, where judgment once seemed to have the final word. That is Isaiah at his most patient, and perhaps his most severe. He demands that hope begin not where circumstances remain grand, but where God has chosen to grow something holy out of what human arrogance already ruined. And maybe that is why the promised ruler feels so trustworthy in this vision. He does not emerge from untouched success. He comes from loss survived. He does not ignore the poor, because the poor belong to the very soil from which the promise rises. He does not flatter appearances, because the whole prophecy began in a cut-down royal house. He does not fear the nations, because the nations have already been measured. He belongs to the logic of God more than the habits of thrones. Stay with him a little longer. The spirit resting. Justice unhurried. Righteousness like a belt around the waist. Faithfulness around the loins. It is such an embodied image, almost practical, as though Isaiah wants holiness to be worn, not merely admired from afar. A king dressed not first in jewels, but in moral steadiness. That alone would be miracle enough for most histories. And now the field grows wider again. More animals at peace. More children, unafraid. More old instincts falling quiet. The mountain holding them all in a single calm. The knowledge of the Lord deepening over everything, the way water deepens over stones on the riverbed, until the stones are still there, but no longer dry. You can almost hear the silence of such a world. Not empty silence, but healed silence. The kind that follows when creatures no longer need to brace themselves against one another every moment. That is where this part must rest. On the edge of healed creation, on the promise of a ruler unlike the kings before him, on the remnant gathered home, on divided relatives reconciled, on the astonishing thought that history, after all its violence, still bends toward peace under a king who sees rightly, judges kindly, and fills the world with the knowledge of God rather than the noise of pride. If the branch from Jesse's stump gives Isaiah one of his clearest images of royal hope, the servant songs give him one of his strangest and most sorrowful. The source transcript turns toward that figure with exactly the right kind of caution. Not rushed, not flattened. The servant in Isaiah is one of those presences in Scripture who seems at first almost hidden by the softness of his appearance, then slowly grows impossible to ignore. He is not introduced with the usual machinery of triumph. No parade, no polished armor, no clever speech about strategic advantage. In fact, the opposite. No beauty that we should desire him. Despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. The words move with a hush that still feels dangerous when read slowly. In a prophetic book crowded with kings, empires, idols, armies, ruined cities, and cosmic images, Isaiah suddenly places at the center a figure defined by suffering. I have always found that shift breathtaking. Human imagination usually expects salvation to arrive looking victorious in the familiar way. Isaiah dares to imagine that the saving figure may look, to the ordinary eye, like failure. If you stand beside the servant in the imagination, there is almost nothing outward to impress a courtier. Dust on the feet, fatigue in the face. The weariness of one who has carried more than his visible share. Perhaps that is why the source lingers not only on the suffering itself, but on the misunderstanding around it. We esteemed him stricken. We thought the pain meant rejection. That is one of the cruelest human habits. We look at someone under affliction and assume God must have abandoned them, when the deeper truth may be that they are carrying what others cannot bear. The servant bears griefs, not only his own, carries sorrows, not only his own, is wounded for transgressions, not only his own. The language is intimate and substitutionary, and almost too heavy to hold if you sit with it honestly. Isaiah has already shown us social injustice, royal pride, false worship, divided kingdoms, looming empire, and the collapse of public trust. Now he moves into the hidden chamber of guilt itself. The problem was never only foreign policy. It was the human heart estranged from God and from one another. The servant enters that depth, The source wisely lets the healing image stay near the wound. By his stripes we are healed. It is not sentimental healing, not a sunny denial that suffering happened. It is healing through carried pain. That is why the servant's songs are so haunting. They do not remove the scar. They transform its meaning. I think this is one of the places where Isaiah becomes almost unbearable in his beauty. The prophet who was given a coal on his own lips now speaks of a figure whose suffering seems to cleanse many others. The one who saw guilt and uncleanness in himself and his people now imagines a servant who can somehow deal with that uncleanness at its root. The pattern deepens. Fire purified Isaiah. The servant absorbs wound itself. And yet the servant is not the only bright thread in this later section. The source also widens toward comfort for exiles. And that movement is crucial, because without it, the book would remain all height and anguish. Comfort, comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. That opening still feels like a hand laid gently on a fevered forehead. After so much denunciation, so much warning, so much collapse, tenderness arrives and does not apologize for its softness. Imagine the exiles hearing such words generations after Isaiah first spoke. Their city damaged, their certainties gone, temple memory aching more than helping, the old songs difficult to sing in a foreign land, children asking questions parents are tired of answering, dust of another empire on their clothes. Into that weariness comes the voice. Comfort. Your warfare ended. Your iniquity pardoned. The God who once sounded like judgment now sounds like return. The source is right to dwell on shepherd imagery here. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them close to his heart. I have always loved that Isaiah can move from seraphim and thrones to a shepherd lifting lambs without any strain in the transition. The God of devastating holiness is also the God of intimate tenderness. One does not cancel the other. They complete one another. You know that feeling when someone strong enough to be feared chooses instead to handle weakness gently. That is what these chapters do to the imagination. They retrain power itself. And then the promises deepen. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through waters, I will be with you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned. Isaiah keeps using dangerous elements this way. Water, fire, wilderness, darkness, not to pretend they will vanish, but to promise presence within them. The source treats this beautifully because it shows that comfort in Isaiah is never denial. Exile is still exile. Fire is still fire. Flood is still flood. The gift is companionship that outruns destruction. There is another startling turn the source handles well, and that is Cyrus, a foreign ruler, a pagan emperor in ordinary terms, yet somehow named as shepherd, as an instrument of restoration. I have always found that both politically and spiritually delicious. God is so little trapped by our categories that he can use the hand of a man outside Israel's covenant life to bring his people home. Imagine hearing that for the first time. Some would have been scandalized, some relieved, some both at once. Isaiah keeps refusing the neat boxes people build around divine action. If you were standing with the exiles when such a word was heard, perhaps in a dim room, perhaps by a canal, perhaps after a day of labor in a land that was not home, you might feel a trembling kind of incredulity. Home through Cyrus, deliverance through a foreign decree, history itself being bent by a God who refuses to be provincial. The Lord of hosts is not merely stronger than idols. He is freer than our expectations of how salvation should look. The source also begins moving toward the great feast imagery and the swallowing up of death. And here Isaiah becomes almost too luminous for ordinary speech. A feast on the mountain for all peoples, rich food, well-aged wine, tears wiped away, the shroud over the nations destroyed, death swallowed forever. There are few passages in Scripture that feel more like the world inhaling after a long nightmare. I find it moving that Isaiah imagines salvation not only as escape, but as feast, not only survival, but abundance, not only pardon, but joy shared among peoples. The prophet who knew famine, Ziga, loss, false worship, and exile does not merely promise smaller pain. He promises celebration after the burial cloth has been torn apart. Stay there for a moment in the imagination. A mountain washed with light, tables prepared, faces once marked by grief, now astonished into gladness, tears on cheeks. Yes, but these are the last tears, the kind that come when sorrow begins to release its hold and the body hardly knows how to behave without it. Death itself, that old silent empire over every house, and king and child and widow, finally treated not as inevitability, but as prey. Honestly, I think that is why Isaiah continues to matter so fiercely. He does not offer comfort that leaves death and injustice untouched. He drives the promise all the way down. New ruler, healed creation, suffering servant, comforted exiles, waters crossed, fire survived, foreign emperor used for mercy, death swallowed. There is no level of human darkness at which he stops speaking hope, and the hope continues into new creation, new heavens and a new earth. Jerusalem not merely repaired, but recreated in joy, long life, peace, wolves and lambs again. Labor no longer stolen by futility, weeping transformed. That closing horizon matters because it reveals the true scale of the book. Isaiah was never only trying to save Judah from one invasion. He was bearing witness to God's final answer to all the fractures that entered the story from the beginning. The source keeps this final movement connected to the earlier ones, and that is exactly right. New creation means more because old creation was stained by injustice. The banquet matters because famine was real. The shepherd comforts because exile was real. The servant heals because guilt was real. The branch from the stump matters because the tree was really cut down. Isaiah is luminous precisely because he never cheated on darkness. If you were sitting with him now at the far edge of the story, you might look back and see the whole arc together. The divided kingdom, Uzziah's death, the throne vision, the coal, deaf hearers, corrupt noblesse, vineyard judgment, Ahaz refusing, Emmanuel promised, Hezekiah weeping to the wall, the shadow retreating, Assyria falling back. Nations judged, the proud lowered, then the deeper turn, servant, shepherd, comfort, waters, Cyrus, feast, death, undone, new earth. No wonder the book feels immense. It contains an entire theology of history, and at the center of it all is the Holy One who judges because he refuses to abandon, and saves because he refuses to lie about what must be healed. So let this part end not in noise, but in the hush before the feast, the mountain still visible ahead, the servant's wounds still glowing with meaning not yet fully understood, the exiles beginning to believe that home is not a joke, the nations discovering they are not outside mercy, death itself hearing footsteps approach. In the next movement, we can keep following that brightness as it settles into Isaiah's final vision of peace, glory, and a world remade enough that even sorrow begins to sound like a story told from very far away. Before we leave, stay a little longer with the servant himself, the one most people would overlook, the one grief would recognize instantly. He does not save by dazzling the eye. He saves by entering the place where the wound is deepest and refusing to turn away. That is why the comfort that follows him feels earned. It has walked through ashes. It has stood in exile. It has listened to the widow, the prisoner, the ashamed, the exhausted. It has knelt beside the people who thought history was over and spoken softly until their breathing changed. And then look up again to the mountain. The feast still waiting. The tables still bright. The song not fully started yet, but almost. That is where Isaiah keeps leaving the listener. Between wound and healing. Between exile and home. Between the servant still misunderstood and the world that will one day understand what he carried. It is one of the tenderest suspensions in all prophecy, because the promise is already real, and yet the full joy of it still stands ahead, drawing every grieving thing toward a morning it has not yet seen. The source hints too at the strange patience of that waiting. Promise does not erase the long walk between hearing and fulfillment. Exiles still wake in foreign rooms. Older people still die before seeing the full return. Children still ask why the city of God can be remembered more easily than reached. And yet the promise keeps working on them the way dawn works on a dark horizon. First, by changing edges. Then by changing color, then by revealing forms that were already there but hidden in the night. That is how Isaiah's comfort breathes, not by pretending the darkness was imaginary, but by teaching weary souls how to live toward light before light has finished arriving. So if you stand at the edge of this part one last time, you can feel all of those currents at once. The servant carrying pain, the shepherd gathering lambs, the exile hearing his name spoken tenderly, Cyrus moving in history without fully knowing whose hand guides him, the mountain waiting with its impossible meal, the old burial cloth loosening, the first air of new creation touching a tired face. Isaiah holds all of that together without strain. Judgment, tenderness, wound, mercy, history, and eternity, all of it moving toward one another until the whole vision begins to sound like a heart finally learning a slower and holier beat. After the servant, after the comfort spoken to exiles, after the promise of return and the mountain feast, where death itself is finally treated like a defeated thing, Isaiah begins gathering his visions into something even wider. The source transcript moves this way very naturally, and I think it is exactly the right movement. Hope in Isaiah is never satisfied with saving one wounded corner of the world. It keeps widening until even the horizon seems too small for what he is trying to say. By this point in the story, the old map has already been shaken. Judah has suffered. Kings have failed. Empires have swelled and bent. The people have tasted fear, shame, scatteredness, and the long ache of waiting. Yet Isaiah does not leave them standing forever in the doorway of consolation. He draws them onward, into a world where the center itself is remade. Jerusalem, once corrupted, judged, threatened, and emptied, begins to reappear in his vision, not merely as a city restored to former condition, but as a place transformed so deeply that even the meaning of city becomes holier than before. I have always found that one of the most moving things in Isaiah, he does not only promise return to what was lost. He promises return altered by grace. The city that once held hypocrisy in its courts, frightened diplomacy in its palace rooms, and blood guilt beneath polished ritual, becomes in the vision a place radiant with righteousness and welcome. That kind of hope is harder to believe than simple nostalgia. Nostalgia says we will get our old home back. Isaiah says home itself will be healed. Imagine Jerusalem in the earlier parts of the story. Dust in the lanes, unequal houses, narrow politics, priests moving through sacrifice while widows wait. Then imagine the later vision beginning to rise over that memory. Gates not trembling in fear, walls called salvation, streets no longer carrying the same stale argument between wealth and want. Songs rising, not the strained songs of survival only, but songs of a people beginning to understand that God has not simply dragged them through judgment. He has remade the purpose of their existence. The source gestures toward the nations streaming to the mountain of the Lord. And this is one of the grandest reversals in the whole book. Earlier, the nations were threats, temptations, examples of arrogance, or objects of judgment. Now, many of those same peoples are imagined not merely as humbled spectators, but as seekers. They come saying, "Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, that he may teach us his ways." I love the humility in that line. The nations do not come boasting. They come to learn. If you stand on a high ridge in the imagination and watch that procession, it feels like the old world, unwinding its rivalries, one careful step at a time. Foreign accents blending on the road, sandals from far lands striking the same dust, merchants, former soldiers, widows, rulers, children, old men with staffs, women carrying bundles, all moving upward toward instruction instead of conquest. The mountain that once might have seemed local now becomes magnetic, not because Jerusalem has become politically fashionable, but because truth is there. And what is learned there? The swords become plowshares. Spears become pruning hooks. It is one of those lines people quote so often that the edge can go dull if we are careless. So let us sharpen it again. A sword is not only metal, it is concentrated fear. labor, strategy, expense, memory of enemies, pride of kingdoms, and the hard belief that survival depends on sharpened force. A plowshare is ordinary bread made possible. A pruning hook is patient future fruit. To melt one into the other is not just disarmament. It is moral conversion at the level of civilization. You know that feeling when a room that has long expected an argument suddenly realizes no one is going to start one? There is a physical loosening to it. Isaiah imagines something like that for the world. Nations shall not learn war anymore. The schools of fear close. The old curriculum of suspicion ends. Human hands are retrained toward cultivation. What a mercy that would be. What a strange mercy. Most people would probably not know what to do with their first week in such a world, except sleep. The source also holds on to the brightness of worship here, and I think it should. Isaiah is not imagining peace as mere absence of violence. He is imagining right relation, light, song, pilgrimage, holiness, justice, and rejoicing all belong together. The redeemed do not merely stop bleeding. They begin praising. That distinction matters because it reveals what the world was always for, not bare existence. Glory returned properly to God and shared properly among creatures. I have always loved the lines about those whom the Lord has redeemed returning with singing, everlasting joy upon their heads. It is such a physical image. Joy, not as private mood tucked inside the ribs, but joy worn almost like a crown. Sorrow and sighing flee away. Even the body sounds different in that future. Breath no longer dragged under dread. Mouth no longer forced shut by shame. Song becomes natural again. And still Isaiah keeps the tenderness of repair close to the grandeur of glory. He speaks to the fearful heart. Be strong, fear not. He sees blind eyes opened, deaf ears unstopped, the lame leaping like deer, the mute tongue singing. The source is right to keep these healing images central, because they reveal that the transformation of the world is not only geopolitical or liturgical, it is bodily. Nerves, muscles, eyes, ears, tongues, all the frailties that make human life feel so limited, come under the same redeeming light. If you were sitting beside a stream in the wilderness where Isaiah places some of this imagery, perhaps in a land once associated with thirst and danger, you might hear the first impossible sound. Water where no water should be. Then another sound. Someone laughing who had forgotten the mechanics of laughter. Then feet running where there had only been limping before. Then song from a mouth once locked in silence. The whole wilderness turning from a geography of absence into a geography of surprise. The source also preserves Isaiah's astonishing ability to hold majesty and intimacy together. The Lord is high and holy, yes, but also near to the contrite. Zion is glorious, yes, but also motherly in some passages, feeding and comforting her children. Jerusalem is not merely a capital in the vision. She becomes a woman restored from grief, a mother gathering children, a home repopulated with tenderness after years of emptiness. That emotional register matters. A city restored only in marble would still be cold. Isaiah wants warmth in it. Honestly, This is where I think Isaiah becomes almost too beautiful for summary. His images begin overlapping. Mountain, city, mother, feast, light, water, pilgrimage, healing, song, all of them circling one truth. God does not save by half measures. He restores with abundance. The source hints at wealth flowing into Zion too. The treasures of nations brought not as loot in arrogant triumph, but as tribute transformed into worship. Camels, ships, gold, incense, all the motions of trade and empire redirected into praise. This can sound strange to modern ears, but I think the emotional center is clear. What once fed human pride and rivalry is now offered back to God. The energies of civilization are not destroyed. They are purified. Imagine the old port cities again. Tyre and its cousins, in spirit if not in name. The smell of salt, rope, cheddar, foreign goods, bargaining voices. Now imagine ships arriving not with threat, not with the latest machinery of vanity, but with gifts for a holy city. The noise of commerce softened into procession. Even economies learning reverence. And then the light imagery deepens further. The sun shall no longer be your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give light to you, but the Lord will be your everlasting light. There is something almost dangerous in that promise, because it sounds as if creation itself is being surpassed from within by the glory of its Maker. Day and night as we know them are not denied exactly, but relativized. Creaturely light becomes secondary next to divine presence. That is the kind of hope one can only speak after living through enough darkness that ordinary sunrise has stopped feeling sufficient. I think that is why these chapters breathe so strangely. They are not written by a man who needed prettier scenery. They are written by a man who knew that without God, even sunlight can fall on ruins without healing them. What he promises is not better weather. It is glory. The source also lets the ethical texture remain. No violence heard in your land. No devastation within your borders. Your people all righteous. This matters because Isaiah's final hope is not detached from the earlier moral demands. The city that becomes radiant does not do so by ignoring justice. It does so by finally being conformed to it. The poor are not forgotten in the light. They are among the reasons the light is good. You know that feeling when someone speaks about peace in a way that makes you suspicious because it sounds expensive only for the weak. Isaiah's peace is not like that. It protects. It heals. It dignifies. It teaches. It feeds. It gathers. It is not peace imposed by the proud. It is peace sustained by the presence of the Holy One. By this stage in the book, Jerusalem almost stops feeling like one geographical point and starts feeling like the name of a future where God dwells openly among a healed people. That does not erase the literal city. It transfigures its meaning. The stone streets of the old capital, with all their memory of kings and fear and betrayal, become seed form for something that overflows national boundaries without abandoning historical rootedness. Stay there for a little while. Pilgrims climbing, instruments sounding, children unafraid, lamps almost unnecessary because the city itself feels bright. An old widow at the gate realizing her years of loss did not cancel her place in the promise. A craftsman hearing foreign languages in the market and no longer tightening with suspicion. Priests serving without pretense. Former enemies standing under the same light, looking slightly embarrassed by how long they hated one another. The whole city breathing differently. I think that is the emotional genius of Isaiah. He can make a final future feel both cosmic and domestic. He speaks of nations and glory and everlasting light, yet he also lets you imagine gates, songs, mothers, children, bodies, roads, meals, faces. Salvation is not vapor. It is textured. And from this height, the final horizon begins to appear even more clearly. If Jerusalem can be transformed this way, if the nations can be taught peace, if worship can draw all peoples, if healing can enter even the wilderness, then perhaps creation itself is ready for a deeper remaking. The next and final step in Isaiah's vision moves beyond city and history into new heavens and a new earth, where even memory of sorrow begins to thin. And the prophet who once trembled beneath temple smoke becomes the herald of an order so renewed that the old world can only be understood as the labor pains before it. Before we leave this part entirely, keep one more image close. A craftsman at a gate, once scarred by siege, now carving wood for beauty instead of repair. A singer from a distant nation, learning the songs of Zion with a new accent and no shame in it. An old priest standing under evening light and realizing the temple service he once knew was only the first sketch of a worship now filling the world. Even the dust in the street seems changed. Not gone, but gentled, because feet no longer race in fear over it. That is how Isaiah's final Jerusalem feels. Not polished into cold perfection, but warmed from within by the presence that once made him tremble. When Isaiah reaches the far horizon of his visions, he does not stop at a healed city, or at nations streaming to worship, or even at the great mountain feast where death is swallowed up. He goes farther still. The source transcript follows him there, and it feels right that the whole journey ends in that widening, because once you have seen the servant bear grief, the exiles comforted, the nations gathered, Jerusalem made radiant, and the world taught peace, the next question rises almost by itself. Can the old creation itself hold all that glory, or must everything become new? Isaiah answers with the kind of sentence that sounds at first almost too large to process. New heavens and a new earth. I have always loved the severity and tenderness of that phrase together. Severity, because it quietly admits the old order is too wounded to be simply polished. Tenderness, because it promises not annihilation into blankness, but renewal vast enough that joy can finally breathe without fear. If you sit with those words slowly, they begin to change the whole weight of the book behind them. The divided kingdom, the corrupt nobles, the idols, Ahaz and his false trust, Hezekiah's illness, Assyria, exile, mourning, all of it remains real, but none of it remains final. Isaiah does not deny history. He outlasts it in vision. Imagine waking into such a world. The first sensation might not even be visual. It might be the absence of old tension in the body, the way shoulders no longer brace before understanding why, the way breath comes deeper, the way listening changes when the heart is not waiting for the next blow. Then, sight arrives. Fields not carrying the same fatigue. Streets not remembering blood in the same way. Light without threat in it. Work without futility souring it. The atmosphere of existence itself altered. The source is careful to keep the continuity between this final renewal and the earlier promises. Long life. Houses inhabited by the ones who built them. Vineyards enjoyed by those who planted them. Labor no longer handed over to others in cruel reversal. This is profoundly important. Isaiah's final future is not an abstract spiritual cloudland. It is justice entering the most ordinary structures of human life. Building, planting, eating, raising children, dwelling securely. All the daily things history so often poisons are healed from within. I have always found that detail one of the most beautiful in the whole prophetic tradition. People shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. If you remember the earlier house-to-house, field-to-field judgment, the earlier greed swallowing the vulnerable, then this promise lands with enormous weight. The final world reverses exploitation. The laborer finally receives the fruit. The old wound in human society is answered not by pious distraction, but by justice, and the emotional atmosphere changes with it. No more children born only for terror. No more households built under the expectation that loss will eventually own them. Imagine a mother in such a world lying awake at night, not because she fears what empire or famine or sickness might do to the child beside her, but simply because love is still deep and sleep is still slow to come sometimes. That alone would be almost too merciful for history. The source also keeps close the line about the wolf and the lamb feeding together once more, and that matters. The peaceable kingdom was not a decorative interlude earlier. It belongs to the deepest logic of the renewal. Predation itself loosens. Fear no longer educates every creature from birth. Even the serpent image remains, but diminished. A reminder that evil is not denied, only rendered unable to rule the landscape as before. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. The old sentence returns like a bell, and by the end of the book it sounds even richer than before, because now the whole creation seems to share the mountain atmosphere. There is something quietly astonishing in how bodily these final chapters remain. Nursing, building, planting, birth, aging, feasting, worship. Isaiah never becomes embarrassed by embodiment. The redeemed future is not a future where creatureliness is discarded. It is a future where creatureliness is finally safe. You know that feeling when a room is so calm that even an animal's posture changes? It lies down differently. It breathes more openly. That is what Isaiah's new world feels like. Not static, but unthreatened in a way old creation never quite managed. And still there is worship. That is essential. New moon to new moon, Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before the Lord. The source rightly leaves this note in place, because worship is not the interruption of the good world. It is the pulse of it. The healed creation does not become self-admiring. It remains turned toward its source. The throne vision from the beginning of the book is not forgotten. It has finally filled the whole horizon. I think that is why the beginning and the ending of Isaiah belong together so beautifully. In the year King Uzziah died, one man entered the temple and saw the Lord high and lifted up, while smoke filled the house. At the end of the book, that holiness has expanded outward until the house has become the world renewed. The prophet who once cried that he was undone among a people of unclean lips now speaks of all flesh coming to worship in a creation made fit for joy. The coal at the lips was the seed of the cosmos remade. The source also hints at the emotional mystery of memory in the renewed world. Former things not remembered in the same binding way. Not because history is erased like a damaged tablet wiped clean with no trace left, but because grief no longer tyrannizes recollection. I have always wondered about that. Perhaps the wounds remain known, but not sharp. Perhaps the old world becomes like winter remembered from within a safe spring morning. One does not deny the cold. One is no longer governed by it. That may be one of the kindest things God can do for a suffering creature. Not make them stupid about the past. Make them free from its power to imprison the heart. So let us walk slowly through this final world as Isaiah gives it. A city awake in peace, the sound of work beginning, but without dread. A father leaving for the vineyard and knowing its fruit will feed his own table. A mother lifting a child without fear that history will simply snatch the child away for someone else's ambition. An elder under a tree in no hurry to explain sorrow, because sorrow no longer sets the terms of conversation. Pilgrims moving toward worship, not because disaster forced them to beg, but because beauty naturally draws them. The poor not waiting outside the gates in neglect, because the gates have learned their purpose. Animals resting without old panic in their eyes. The mountain still holy, the world finally wide enough to share its peace. Honestly, I think that is one reason Isaiah has outlived so many empires that seemed more solid than his own little kingdom. He understood that human beings do not only need warning, they need a future worthy of repentance. A people will not keep turning from idols if the truth offered in their place feels thin. Isaiah offers them the largest truth imaginable. The Holy One who judges also intends a world where justice, worship, tenderness, and delight no longer compete. The source never lets that brightness become cheap, and neither should we. This future costs the whole journey that came before it. The temple terror, the coal, the deafness of the people, the broken vineyard, the frightened kings, the Assyrian taunts, the tears in the sick room, the servant wounded, the exile comforted, the nations humbled, the old creation groaning toward a better answer. All of it is carried forward into this final stillness. That is why it feels earned. Not because humans earned it, but because the book has told the truth about what had to be healed. If you were sitting with Isaiah in his old age, if old age indeed held him long enough to sense the weight of his own ministry, I imagine there would have been moments when the burden must have felt impossibly heavy. To speak to people who would not hear, to watch kings refuse, to announce judgment over the beloved city, to carry hope larger than present evidence. It is almost too much for one life, yet perhaps the reason he could carry it was that the final vision had become more real to him than the immediate noise around him. Not less painful than history, more substantial than history. That is a lesson I keep finding in Isaiah. Reality is not limited to what is currently collapsing. And so the final tone should not be frantic. It should be restful. The whole book has been moving toward rest in the deepest biblical sense. Not idleness, not sleep alone. Rest as rightness. Rest as every created thing finally in its proper relation. The judge no longer bribed. The widow no longer ignored. The nations no longer boasting. The child no longer endangered. The laborer no longer robbed. The worshiper no longer divided in heart. The world no longer resisting its maker, like a dislocated limb resisting the hand that tries to heal it. Stay there now with the renewed earth. The air clear. The light kind. The old dread no longer hidden in the corners of ordinary life. Water moving where it should. Trees growing without being cut low by greed. Stone warmed by morning without the memory of siege in it. Voices in the city. Many voices, but none sharpened by the old panic. Song rising somewhere, and no one embarrassed by it because joy has become as natural as breathing. And let Isaiah himself recede into that brightness the way prophets often should at the end. Not erased, but outshone by the promise they carried. The man who once stood trembling in smoke has done his work. He has warned. He has wept. He has accused. He has endured. He has sung. He has seen farther than kings and farther than conquerors. Now the vision itself fills the space. So if you listen very closely, perhaps what remains is not one last argument, but one last atmosphere. Temple hush without fear in it. City life without injustice in it. Worship without hypocrisy in it. Light without threat in it. Memory without chains in it. Creation without the old wound ruling it. The whole earth, at last, answering the holiness Isaiah heard at the beginning, not with terror alone, but with peace. And maybe that is the most fitting ending of all. The prophet who began by crying out because he was unclean ends by leaving us in a world where cleansing has gone so deep that even the structure of sorrow has changed. A world where judgment has done its severe mercy. A world where salvation is no longer promise only, but air and soil and song and work and feast and light. A world where everything torn has been patiently bound. A world where the Holy One is no longer glimpsed through smoke only, but known everywhere by the peace His presence gives. And if one more question lingers, perhaps it is this. What becomes of the little daily griefs that once seemed too small for prophecy? The lonely meal, the anxious night, the letter that never came, the room where someone waited too long for healing. Isaiah does not list them one by one, yet the new earth he sees feels wide enough for all of them to be answered. That is part of its tenderness. Nothing true is lost. Even the hidden sorrows are gathered into the remaking. So when the final peace settles over his vision, it does not float above ordinary life. It enters the ordinary fully and leaves nothing outside its mercy. The hearth of the world is no longer guarded by fear. The gates are no longer watched by suspicion. The field is no longer measured by scarcity alone. Everything once clenched begins to open. And because it opens under God, nothing good is lost in the opening. Good night.